Welcome to the debate, Climate Justice. Is a green future actually possible for everyone? Today we analyze the ideas from the book The Just Transition, Crafting an Equitable Climate Future.
Welcome to the debate.
So imagine a city spends $2 billion building this massive state-of-the-art seawall to protect a vulnerable coastal neighborhood from climate change.
Right, a massive engineering project.
Exactly. And 10 years later, the neighborhood is perfectly dry, but the original residents, they are entirely gone.
Oh, because of the property values?
Yeah, they were evicted because the new seawall caused their rent to triple. Usually when we talk about large-scale global crises like a pandemic or, an economic collapse, there is this expectation of precision and just sheer mechanical force.
You identify the threat, you deploy the resources, and you build the defense. It's a clean binary.
Framework just shatters.
Well, it shatters because the reality of execution is incredibly messy. And above all, the clock is ticking on these ecological tipping points, right? We desperately want solutions to be visible, categorized, and fast.
We do. But climate change isn't merely an environmental crisis. It is a profound generational challenge regarding human equity, survival, and how communities adapt to existential threats.
Which brings us to the core of what we're looking at today.
Exactly. The central question we are tackling is this: can we successfully build a climate-resilient future by placing social justice and equitable wealth distribution at the very center of our technological and economic response?
And we are definitely coming at this from two very different angles.
Definitely. My position is that treating climate strategy and community empowerment as inseparable is the absolute only way to achieve lasting resilience. I mean, if we just build green infrastructure without addressing the historical vulnerabilities of the communities hosting it, we're building a brittle future. It's going to shatter under the weight of the next crisis.
And I come at it from a different way. While the moral appeal of that framework is totally undeniable, burdening urgent life-saving climate action with the slow, complex work of systemic wealth redistribution and grassroots consensus, it might fatally compromise our ability to implement practical solutions in time.
You think it slows us down too much?
I do. We are talking about existential threats to the global biosphere. Tying rapid global decarbonization to the dismantling of systemic historical injustices it's like trying to rewrite the building code while the house is currently on fire. We just need to put the fire out first.
Okay, but to put that fire out permanently, you have to understand why the house caught fire to begin with. Let's lay out our core perspectives before diving into the specific live proposals from the material. From my vantage point, the methods we are examining today, like targeted equitable finance, community-led land trusts, localized green infrastructure, these aren't just social programs.
You see them as survival tools.
Highly practical, transformative survival tools. We have communities that are inherently fragile today because of historical injustices. Consider historical zoning practices like redlining, where banks literally drew red lines on maps to deny loans and services to minority neighborhoods.
Right, forcing them into the lowest, most flood-prone zones.
Exactly, and heavily industrialized zones. Plus, extractive economics stripped the wealth out of coal towns for generations. If we just swap out a coal plant for a solar farm owned by the exact same distant multinational corporation, we haven't solved the vulnerability.
The community is still economically hollow.
Yes, they remain economically hollowed out and totally unable to recover when a shock hits. By addressing these root historical vulnerabilities, equitable strategies don't just reduce carbon. They build robust, self-sustaining local economies capable of surviving those shocks.
Look, I understand the desire to right historical wrongs. I really do. But my perspective focuses purely on practical efficiency and macro survival. The physics of a warming planet do not care about human equity.
But human beings do.
Sure, but we need gigawatts of clean energy deployed yesterday. We need to overhaul global agriculture and harden coastal defenses worldwide. Is this realistic for a global population facing imminent collapse?
I think it is.
But if we demand that every solar panel, every microgrid, and every seawall perfectly dismantles systemic racism and redistributes wealth, we risk a massive administrative bottleneck. We lose the precious time we have left.
I see why you think that, but moving from the high-level philosophy of justice down to the actual dollars and cents of how a green future is financed, it changes the picture completely. Justice is an economic mechanism. Let's look at the economics of equity.
Okay, let's look at the money.
One of the live proposals on the table is the pairing of a carbon tax with a robust dividend program, alongside aggressive community wealth building.
Well, hold on. Carbon taxes are famously difficult to pass, and for good reason. They are structurally regressive.
If done poorly, sure.
Without immense bureaucratic oversight, they hurt the poorest people who spend a significantly higher percentage of their daily income on energy, heating, and fuel. You can look at the Yellow Vest protests in France a few years ago to see what happens when you tax working-class fuel consumption to fund green initiatives.
Which is exactly why the dividend is the crucial mechanism that flips the script. You don't just tax carbon and absorb the money into a general government fund.
So where does it go?
You tax the carbon at the source, the heavy industrial polluters, and you legally mandate that those revenues are redistributed directly to low and middle income households in the form of monthly checks.
Okay, a direct subsidy?
Right. It entirely offsets their increased energy costs and heavily stimulates the local economy. But even more transformative than the dividend is the push for community ownership of green assets. Take the Black Mesa Solar Cooperative model as an example.
For former coal towns, right?
Exactly. This is a framework designed for former coal-dependent towns. Instead of a multinational energy company coming in, leasing the land, and siphoning the profits out of state, the community utilizes municipal green bonds to build and own a decentralized solar cooperative.
But does this actually work in the long run? Because capital mobilization at the community level is painfully slow. To transition the global economy, we need trillions of dollars mobilized overnight.
It's not about doing it overnight, it's about doing it right.
But multinational corporations and centralized power authorities have the logistics, the global supply chains, and the institutional capital to drop a 500-megawatt solar farm into a region in a matter of months. You are asking former coal miners to suddenly become experts in navigating federal bond issuances?
They don't have to do it alone, though.
Still, managing complex electrical grid interconnects, running cooperative board meetings, the bureaucracy of equity could literally cost us the decade we have left to hit our emissions targets.
Well, by structuring as a cooperative, the capital doesn't bleed out to a corporate shareholder in London or New York. The revenue generated by the solar energy is legally bound to the local zip code,
So it stays in the community.
automatically reinvested into local grid hardening and job retraining. This means when the next megastorm hits, they literally have the cash reserves and the localized supply chains to repair their own infrastructure. They aren't waiting for a paralyzed federal disaster agency to show up.
I mean, theoretically, yes.
Think of a centralized, top-down energy grid operated by massive corporations like an agricultural monocrop, like 1,000 acres of a single genetically identical strain of corn.
Okay, I'm following.
It is highly efficient, yes, it produces massive volume quickly, but it is incredibly vulnerable. A single disease or a single severe drought wipes out the entire system overnight because there is no localized adaptation. A decentralized, community-owned green grid is like a biodiverse forest. It is locally adapted, economically resilient, and politically stable.
But a biodiverse forest takes centuries to mature. We have less than a decade. You are trading the speed of corporate execution for a romantic ideal of local governance.
It's not romantic, it's practical.
When a centralized grid fails, yes, it's catastrophic, but large corporations have armies of engineers to rebuild it. When a local cooperative faces a supply chain shortage for proprietary solar inverters, they are entirely helpless.
I disagree, and we have real-world data to prove it. Look at Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria.
The grid collapsed.
Right. The centralized corporate-managed power grid failed entirely, leaving the island in darkness for months. But in the town of Adjuntas, community-owned decentralized solar microgrids kept the lights on.
Because they were isolated.
They survived because they didn't rely on a fragile top-down transmission system. They were locally built, locally maintained, and locally governed. Efficiency without equity creates systemic fragility.
Okay, you say decentralization works for microgrids, but a solar panel is a relatively simple technology to install on a roof.
What happens when we apply this grassroots theory to massive civil engineering? We are talking about governance, the speed of execution, and this concept of, co-creation.
Co-creation, yes.
When you scale up to protecting entire coastlines, decision-making has to be swift and decisive.
Well, co-creation is vital precisely because massive civil engineering impacts millions of lives. True climate justice demands a shift from top-down decrees to genuinely inclusive policymaking. Look at the Green Heart City Initiative proposal.
The one addressing coastal and river flooding?
Exactly. Cities trying to manage severe flooding. The standard top-down engineering approach is to just pour concrete. You build a massive flood barrier and elevate the infrastructure in the commercial and financial zones, right? Because that's where the most capital is concentrated.
It's fast, and it's a known engineering quantity.
Yeah, but
And it works. It stops the storm surge from destroying the economic engine of the city.
the hydrodynamics dictate that the water has to go somewhere. When you build a massive wall around the financial district without consulting the surrounding communities, you inadvertently push those floodwaters directly into lower-income, unfortified neighborhoods downriver.
So you're saying the solution displaces the problem?
Exactly. The co-creation model shifts that power dynamic. Through direct, binding participation in city planning commissions, local residents push for decentralized green infrastructure.
Instead of a wall.
Instead of one massive concrete wall that displaces the problem, they build community-managed urban wetlands and permeable pavements. These act as natural sponges across the entire city, paired with localized job training and ecological restoration. It solves the flooding, creates local jobs, and improves food security simultaneously.
But what are the real-world risks of this participatory approach, though? I want you to really think about the physics of a changing climate.
I am thinking about them.
Sea levels are rising by the millimeter every single day. A Category 5 storm does not care about your public comment period. Taking 18 months to run participatory community workshops, establish advisory boards, and debate the placement of urban wetlands could be disastrous.
It doesn't have to take 18 months if the structures are already in place.
But is the demand for inclusive participation holding up life-saving engineering? We cannot hold infrastructure hostage to local consensus.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because top-down engineering frequently creates entirely new, highly expensive disasters. Let's go back to the seawall example from the beginning of our discussion.
The rent tripling?
Right. When centralized authorities rush in and build heavy resilience infrastructure in a marginalized neighborhood without community input or rent protections, it almost universally triggers green gentrification.
Property values spike.
The new seawall goes in, the neighborhood is suddenly deemed a secure, climate-resilient zone, property values absolutely skyrocket, and the original vulnerable residents are priced out. They are evicted and displaced to cheaper, unfortified areas that are even more susceptible to climate shocks.
So the cycle continues.
That is an incredibly inefficient use of resources. You've protected the physical dirt, but you've actively endangered the people it was supposed to protect. It creates secondary economic and housing crises that city governments then have to spend billions of tax dollars to solve. Co-creation prevents that displacement by tying physical infrastructure to housing policy.
Okay, you say co-creation works for flood infrastructure and prevents displacement, but what happens when we apply this grassroots theory to something as complex as the global food supply?
Food supply is a huge part of this.
Because if you decentralize agriculture to avoid corporate monopolies, billions of people could literally starve. I look at the proposals for grassroots resilience, especially as they relate to deploying technology on the front lines, and I see a dangerous romanticization of the local.
It is not romanticization. It's about structural endurance. And we see this in proposals like community land trust to manage coastal retreat or utilizing urban agriculture models like the Black Creek Community Farm.
But is this realistic as a macro survival strategy? You cannot community land trust your way out of a global famine.
Well, you absolutely can use community land trust to manage the localized impacts of global crises. Let me explain how the mechanism works.
Go ahead.
A community land trust, or CLT, is a nonprofit organization that acquires land and takes it completely out of the speculative real estate market. They own the land, and residents own the homes on top of it, with legally capped resale values to guarantee permanent affordability.
Okay, so it stops speculation.
Right, so in a coastal region facing sea level rise, a CLT can step in post-disaster, preventing predatory developers from buying up destroyed neighborhoods for pennies. The CLT can manage a staged, equitable retreat.
Moving people inland?
They slowly convert vulnerable coastal properties into mangrove forests that act as natural storm buffers for the rest of the city, while ensuring the displaced residents are moved into affordable, community-owned housing further inland.
But what about the food aspect?
When you combine that structural protection with urban farming and indigenous ecological knowledge, like integrating traditional fire management or soil sequestration with affordable, open-source, off-grid tech, you empower communities to be entirely self-reliant.
Look, urban community farms are fantastic for social cohesion. They provide much-needed green space, they teach youth about agriculture and healthy eating. I am not denying their immense social value.
But
But they absolutely cannot feed a metropolitan area during a global supply chain collapse. They just do not have the caloric output. We are facing a future where shifting weather patterns and megadroughts could wipe out traditional breadbaskets in a single season.
which is why local resilience is so important.
To feed 8 billion people, we don't need community garden plots. We need precision agriculture. We need drought-resistant GMOs, AI-driven resource management grids, and massive proprietary technological deployment. You are arguing for a system that optimizes for local empowerment, but we need a system that optimizes for maximal caloric yield and carbon drawdown.
But who controls that yield? If a handful of tech monopolies control the patents on the drought-resistant seeds, the AI farming grids, and the proprietary water filtration tech, the vulnerable communities are entirely at their mercy.
They are dependent, yes,
That is not resilience, that is feudalism.
but they will be fed. That is the fundamental tension here. Should we really be slowing down tech rollouts to ensure they perfectly align with local cultural traditions?
It's not just about traditions, it's about survival.
Open source is highly democratic, but if an advanced, proprietary carbon capture technology, backed by billions in venture capital, can pull millions of tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere today, should we reject it because it isn't a community-governed project?
No, we shouldn't reject the technology, but we must govern its deployment ethically. This is a concept the framework refers to as innovation with integrity.
So don't ban it, just regulate it.
The proposal isn't to abandon advanced science. But if that massive carbon capture facility is built next to a marginalized neighborhood and it emits localized toxic byproducts or, requires millions of gallons of the local water table to operate, then it is actively perpetuating environmental injustice.
A localized cost for a global benefit.
Right. And that's unacceptable. The technology must be screened through an equity impact assessment. If we don't mandate local empowerment, skill transfer, and accessibility, technology just becomes another weapon of disenfranchisement. The local community bears the physical cost of the infrastructure, while the global north reaps the atmospheric benefit.
But the ultimate disenfranchisement is a collapsed biosphere. I worry that treating climate strategy as an intersectional battleground for every social ill, from housing policy and rent control to wealth inequality and historical racism, it paralyzes us.
It doesn't have to.
When you make a problem about everything, it becomes impossible to solve anything.
I hear your urgency, I really do. But I argue that the climate crisis is a problem of everything. It wasn't created in a vacuum. It was created by the exact same extractive economic systems that created wealth inequality and systemic marginalization in the first place.
So we have to fix capitalism to fix the climate.
You cannot treat the symptom without treating the disease. We have to move beyond this panicked individualism and embrace collective action. That means environmental activists, labor unions, and marginalized communities forming deep coalitions to demand policies that fundamentally restructure the economy, not just tweak the atmospheric thermostat.
But coalitions require consensus, and consensus takes an agonizing amount of time. Look at the advocacy strategies proposed alongside these green initiatives.
Organizing, lobbying.
Grassroots organizing, direct lobbying, extensive legal action against developers. These are crucial democratic tools, yes, but they are undeniably friction-heavy. Every day spent in a legal battle over the equitable zoning of a new renewable energy plant is a day that plant isn't displacing fossil fuels.
And every plant built without community consent is a plant that will face endless local sabotage, political backlash, and eventual failure because the people it supposedly serves actively resent its existence.
It's a trade-off.
Efficiency without equity is a house built on sand. It might go up incredibly fast, but the moment the political winds change or a localized disaster strikes, it will not withstand the storm.
And equity without efficiency is a beautiful, deeply moral blueprint for a house that never actually gets built, leaving everyone exposed to the elements while they debate the floor plan.
Well, as we synthesize this discourse, I think we have clearly mapped the boundaries of the debate.
We have.
And as we look at the core proposals we've discussed today, carbon dividends that shift wealth, co-created green infrastructure that prevents displacement, community land trusts that manage equitable retreat, and ethical tech deployment, I view the framework presented in the material as a must-try blueprint.
A complete paradigm shift.
It is the only path that offers deep, lasting community resilience. It recognizes that true survival isn't just about mitigating carbon parts per million. It is about unwinding the manufactured economic vulnerabilities of our past so that every community has the financial and structural integrity to weather what is coming.
And while I deeply respect the moral architecture of that position, I maintain that these methods must be approached with extreme caution.
Because of the speed.
Exactly. The framework is brilliant in theory, but in practice, its ideals threaten to paralyze urgent, large-scale climate defense. We simply may not have the luxury of perfectly engineering social justice into every single technological and infrastructural lifeline we throw out to a drowning world. Sometimes, you just have to throw the lifeline and worry about who owns the rope later.
Which brings us back to where we started, the intense friction between doing things fast and doing things right. We are trying to navigate a murky, broken diagnostic landscape where the rapid engineering of survival clashes directly with the human soul and economic reality of the communities we are trying to save.
We invite all of you listening to explore these live proposals further, to weigh the practical efficiency of mass deployment against the necessity of grassroots equity, and to decide for yourselves how we prioritize our survival.
The Klein binary engineering framework might be a comfort, but the reality on the ground is much more complex. As you consider the policies taking shape in your own cities, ask yourself, are we just building a defense against the changing climate, or are we building a future actually worth surviving for?